Yeah, and just to expand on that, so like what we were talking about earlier, like you said, a lot of cultures, and it's not just like Christian. A lot of people think Christianity right away, but it's not just Christianity. Like there's a lot of other cultures and like religions that kind of developed these abstinence procedures, and I think it's really interesting that it wasn't just Christianity, right, that came up with that idea. If you look at Buddhist monks, a lot of their practices with meditation and mindfulness involved abstinence, right? And sometimes I went to really great lengths, like we talked about fasting, and that's kind of shared in those cultures. Abstaining from sexual things, that could be another one. So I think I like what I was talking about earlier before this was like maybe they got this idea from other people, like going through this stuff, other people seeing other people not satisfied with all these pleasures in life and on the earth, right? So like Solomon in the Bible had all the women and riches that he wanted, and he found himself still unsatisfied.
Welcome back to Out of the Box podcast. My name is Jose, and I am here with Steele, your co-host. And today we're going to be talking about an interesting topic about free will or willpower, how we develop our willpower, more to say. But before we actually get started, I want to invite you guys to subscribe to our channel and give us a like down below as well. We would greatly appreciate that, so that we can continue providing amazing content for you guys. So to get started, I really wanted to talk about the aspect of willpower, just because I know we had a topic about becoming a man, but this is really a topic about how to become stronger in making decisions. And I think there's a lot of really interesting words and topics that we can branch off, but one of them being abstinence, and how abstaining from things can actually strengthen desires or power to actually decide what to say, right? You're not carried away with emotions or by personal pleasures and stuff like that. And so when it comes to strengthening one's willpower, Steele, what would you say would be one of the things that I guess for you has helped you strengthen your willpower?
Personally, yeah, that's a good question. I got two things kind of come immediately to mind. So like I think abstinence one from certain things, right? Not to specify right one. Because abstinence, a lot of people assume, oh, that just means sexual abstinence, abstaining from sex or something, but abstinence can mean a lot of different things. It can mean abstaining from, like, I don't know, reading a book. I'm just joking. But yeah,
Yeah,
like that's one thing that
or
comes to
from social media, or
yeah, from
that's
social media. So that's one thing that comes to mind through my because I tried different like abstinence for different things like that in the past, and I did find, yeah, that kind of does equal some changes. Interesting. But another one is perseverance, the development of perseverance. And what do I mean by perseverance? I mean going through like tough times, right? So like going through hardships and overcoming them and coming through them, a different person, I guess, or kind of realizing that you're stronger after going through that, like the loss of a loved one, or like when my biological father passed away, right? Because I live with my aunt and uncle, right? So like when my biological father passed away when I was in college, that was a huge thing that I didn't think would hit me that hard, but it did. And it was really an interesting thing to go through. It kind of started out with denial, and then it moved to like I guess maybe depression or something close to that. And then it kind of translated to anger, and I don't care about anything anymore. And then emptiness, and then it came out, and by the time you get to the end of it, it's like strength. It's interesting how it ends with strength. So I think
Mm,
that's why I really think those two things, because personally, those are the two things that have really affected me the most and strengthened my willpower. I would say the most, and discipline, because I think with willpower comes like discipline and maturity.
yeah. Yeah, it's almost to say that, whenever we're little kids, we just do things out of emotion, or do things out of like whatever we're feeling. Like, hey, we're hungry, we cry. Whenever we need to go to the restroom, we tell our parents that we need to go. We can't hold it. And so it's almost discipline is abstaining from from what our impulses would normally just do, right? Because if we just do things out of impulse and reaction all the time, then we're no different than a little kid,
Yeah,
right?
animal.
We're no different than an animal almost, we just working on instinct, working on whatever happens, like we just feel hungry, we go eat.
Yeah, and then
But
yeah, and Sigmund
it's
Freud, the
almost
psychoanalyst, called that the id. Like I don't know if you heard of the id, the ego, and the superego, kind of
mm, yeah,
like
yeah, yeah, I've heard of it.
three ego states. And of course, today it's Sigmund Freud's stuff isn't taken as seriously. It's not backed up as much by research, right? But I still think that that theoretical kind of model is interesting philosophically. That we have an id, what you're talking about, where we just act on impulse, and then we have an ego, which is kind of in the middle, and then the superego, which is the conscience, the moral compass that says you shouldn't do this, and the ego's caught between the superego, the moral compass, and the id, which is let's just act on impulse. And the ego's trying to balance the anxiety between those two, you know, the anxiety of
Yeah.
not giving in on impulse, which I think anxiety ties into that. Like, I want to do this, I feel anxious if I don't.
But what do you mean by ego? It's not. I I don't want to mistake it by saying like the ego is like
Narcissist.
pompous,
No, it's
person.
different. Yeah, it's a state of. You could think of it as like a state of consciousness, I guess, a state of mind. He divided like the mind into those three kind of, you can picture it like three different people in your head, right? And the id is like the devil or like the animal in the beast that wants everything, sex, money, drugs, any pleasure on the earth, and just wants it instantly. And the ego is like us, kind of like we're like rational, like, yeah, man, maybe I want drugs, right? But I want to go to jail, or I don't want to ruin my brain or something like that. That's the ego. It's in the middle. And then the super ego is like the moral thing. Like you have moral rules, right? Like you may believe certain things that are right and wrong that you don't want to do. And that's the super ego. Yeah.
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 So so is so should we always do what the super ego wants?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean,
Is that like ultimate discipline?
yeah, I mean, and so the super ego, that's a good question. The super ego comes from our parents and how our parents raise us. Basically, like we kind of, what do you call it? We integrate, it goes inside our mind what our parents teach us about morality, and that becomes the conscience could be thought of as our parents' voices in our heads, kind of. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if it's okay to
So
always.
is super ego our consensus or the person's consensus of what it means to be completely virtuous, so that the super ego changes between person to person?
Yeah, if you want to go that route, it could. Yeah, because think about it. Not everyone's raised the same way by their parents. Feral children, for example, or someone who was abused or neglected, or their parents were addicted to drugs or something, right? So they may not have the same conscience, moral compass as you or me. But
Mm,
if you believe in that we should, like in God, and that we should aspire to be like God, then you could say God is the superego that we aspire to. Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
Dang. But it's really coming down to like, well, what is your perception of God then?
Yeah, it
Is
is.
he this like ultimate like uh king who just reigns over everyone and punishes those who do evil, and like, well, it's really clarifying, right, that aspect. But it kind of like how we talked about with Dr. Greenaway, his perception and thought of describing God was the is, just what is, and later as we talked, I don't want to get too much into the podcast because one could go look at that, but we finalized into the saying that God is love, through the conversation that we had. And so if ultimate love and sacrificial love is what God is, then should that be the super ego that we strive to be,
I
you
think we,
know?
yeah, I think we could think of it that way. I often, I mean, sometimes I think of it that way. even though I understand psychologically, like the idea is that the superego comes from our parents, kind of. It's basically like the parents' voice in our head, But then again, as a Christian, I could also kind of see it as God's voice in the head, if that makes sense. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think this is an interesting topic that I didn't think that we were going to touch on.
but yeah,
Because like super ego, and then the it are definitely, very relevant to this topic for sure, like developing willpower. But it really branches into other reasons why some people don't develop that willpower, right? Just because they just don't have a good sense of super ego, or like a good moral like example, to where the closest thing to morality is, maybe their grade school teacher who taught them how to behave in class, and
yep,
that's the most that they know about, virtuousness and morality. And so their moral compass is really not well developed, which means that could lead to them giving it in more into their it than their super ego,
yeah, that's the idea.
right?
Mhm. Exactly. And it's
So
not like we're all free from this, right? We all have an id, ego, and superego. So we do battle with it. That's the idea that Freud was purporting, anyways, right? So the idea of like we all have this darkness in us, and we kind of do. Like we can all have these dark thoughts if we want to, and some people may struggle with it, right? That's the idea. That's the id. The id is those dark thoughts, those dark temptations and impulses in our minds.
yeah,
It's a battle. Some people battle with it more than others, and some people lose the battle, and some people conquer the battle. Some people,
yeah.
yeah,
And I guess kind of going off of that, I guess what I really wanted to focus on this podcast was how to conquer that battle, how to be able to freely decide what you want to do, how to have that willpower. And I think you touched on really important topics, and I think we were kind of talking about this before the podcast, but it was the aspect of abstinence, right? There's different practices that have been done for ages, abstaining from food, abstaining from, in the Christian tradition, the Catholic tradition, there's this time period called Easter where people decide on giving up something, chocolate, giving up on TV, giving up on certain type of music. And so they give up something in order to actually uh, almost to liberate oneself, or to separate the body and the soul from the external aspect of that one thing that's pushing them to create or
take,
causing them to fall under it than their super ego,
yeah, take
right?
control. It's almost like it seems like taking control of yourself and not letting that thing control you, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's
Yeah,
willpower.
and so I because I've tried doing certain things, like um maybe taking cold showers, trying to remember, think about how some people don't have warm water where they live, and it almost comes to the topic that we talked about also before the podcast, which is actually taking for granted some of the things that we do have, because sometimes we're complaining about how we didn't get the right type of milk in our coffee, or we're complaining that you know the air conditioning is not on, while some people don't even have a fan. And so different things that nowadays, like in our society, are really commodities that we have. We can decide when to eat, we can decide when to um have cold air come in, we
Yeah,
can decide if we want the heater on, we can make all these decisions and these comforts at the tip of our fingers almost.
yeah, exactly.
So
I
and
think
so that's why, like, there's this aspect in almost like to the words that you used, a reset button, to say like, hey, I'm gonna remove social media, I'm gonna remove unnecessary use of like computers, or unnecessary use of like screen time.
yeah,
And
mhm,
that almost um that in a way does something to our bodies, because like to the point that we had talked about too, is that we're so surrounded by dopamine,
Yeah, it's triggered off.
like triggers, yes. And so, whether it be like through social media, whether it be through entertainment or movies and that sort of thing, that's just, um, you know, making us, forget about like the reality, and putting us through fantasies and stuff like that. So we almost did voluntarily decide to not be in the moment, right? And then we are wondering why it's hard for us to really focus and be present at family reunions and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
Because I
exactly.
see that nowadays, like people just go to family reunions and the majority of people are on their phones. Uh, Usually the younger generations, but they're not present anymore. They don't even know how their grandparents met. It's different stuff like that
Yeah.
that has been to some degree lost within time, and
Mm.
I think one can lose out on those sort of things. And some people might debate that's not really necessary for some people, that but since we're talking about building up the willpower, um I think that there's really a great strength or that can be developed from us abstaining from certain things.
Yeah, and just to expand on that, so like what we were talking about earlier, like you said, a lot of cultures, and it's not just like a lot of people think Christianity right away, but it's not just Christianity. Like there's a lot of other cultures and like religions that kind of developed these abstinence procedures, and I think it's really interesting that it wasn't just Christianity, right, that came up with that idea. If you look at Buddhist monks, they a lot of their practices with meditation and mindfulness involved abstinence, right? And sometimes I went to really great lengths, like we talked about fasting, and that's kind of shared in those cultures. Abstaining from sexual things, that could be another one. So I think I like what I was talking about earlier before this was like maybe they got this idea from other people, like going through this stuff, other people seeing other people not satisfied with all these pleasures in life and on the earth, right? So like Solomon in the Bible had all the women and riches that he wanted, and he found himself still unsatisfied. You would think it'd be the opposite, but found himself unsatisfied. Or like for example, people who get really kind of dependent on drugs, often after a while the brain changes a certain way and they're unable to experience the same pleasure of the drug as they were before, and then using the drug becomes more about avoiding withdrawal than actually experiencing the original pleasure of the drug, and so it actually becomes more suffering than pleasure. Giving into too much thing, we also talked about in the previous podcast, having too much money. After a while, after you make a certain amount of money, your happiness doesn't increase, is what the research shows. So I think it's fascinating, this idea that having too much pleasure and too much free reign to do whatever you want can often, you would think, lead to satisfaction and more pleasure, but actually it seems to be the case that often leads to more unsatisfaction and more displeasure. And I know I mentioned also Jordan Peterson, how he talks about pornography, right? And how like heavy use of pornography is so easily accessible now, like on the internet, on the phone or computer. It within a second you can have it at almost any time. Whereas before, this is like the first time ever in this generation, but before it was like delegated to magazines where it was harder to gain access to, or it wasn't always there all the time. But Jordan Peterson is kind of mentioning something like that, right? And talking about hookup culture with the dating apps and all of this instant gratification, particularly with porn too, which spikes dopamine really high, like really high compared to other things in life. That constant exposure, like even something like maybe a couple hours every single day for years and years and years, well, you become so desensitized to that dopamine spiking of all the time that the dopamine gets drained. We only have so much. The brain can only produce dopamine so fast. When you're constantly draining it every day with heavy pornography use or something, or whatever it is, something else, right? Heavy social media use, you could say, um, then yeah, you're gonna find yourself less happy because when you don't have enough dopamine, that can lead to depression. And maybe that's why a lot of people in our generation find that there's higher rates of depression. I don't know. But going back to the pornography thing, I think that too, like it desensitizes people to where things that should be exciting, like sex or something like that, um, is not as exciting because you're so desensitized to it through pornography, heavy pornography use. I'm talking about like heavy use, right? Um, and like also we talked about earlier, like you could start here with your first porn experience or something, first exposure, and it's not as exciting after a while. So you have to increase the strangeness of it or the intensity of it by looking for something even crazier in the pornography area. And then you find yourself starting here, and by the end of it, you're like somewhere way crazier than you never thought you would be, because that desensitization, you have to find a way to make it fresh. And that same thing can be applied to like drugs too, like substance use disorders and addiction. There's another word for that, where people kind of have to use different drugs. Like they start with a softer drug, and it desensitization, so they have to go to harder things to make it more exciting, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it makes sense. Like
Wow.
it that desensitization aspect is one of the things that can definitely lead from uh undisciplined, you know, pleasure, right? It's
Yeah,
almost like finding the right balance
balance.
in even and it's kind of hard to say like, well, you need to have balance when like watching pornography. It's like, well, like it in itself, it just naturally leads to wanting more of it. It's kind of like saying like you need a balance of drugs, you know?
Balance
Like,
heroin,
well,
right?
it's like drugs inherently are just gonna want make you want more, right? And so it's not a matter of like balancing, you know, it's a matter of like really having the willpower to just stop it, right?
And I
And
think, you know,
so
like we were talking, I think abstinence is the key to doing that, right?
yeah,
I think it's
because when you can say no to one thing, even if it's a little thing, when you can say no to one thing, you can say no to bigger things,
yeah, and it doesn't
right?
have to just be that, right? So we talked about fasting, or it could be abstaining, right? If you want to see what happens when you abstain from pornography for a month and see, like the no fat movement that I talked to you about does that, right? And of course certain religions do that too, right? So or if you're doing it personally for a different reason, like you just want to see how will this change my brain, and will it increase my happiness, you know? And like it's interesting, it's worth trying and seeing. And how we talked about, I just don't want to lose this idea that we talked about where we mentioned like taking breaks, right? Like maybe if you find in life that you're really depressed and just nothing excites you anymore, maybe try to take a month and pick a few things to abstain from and see if it makes a difference, whether it's abstaining from pornography, social media. Like some people, like there's movements now that have quit social media, and they find that it's actually made them feel happier. You remember you as they talked about dating apps. You stop using Bumble or something, right? Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, because I found that, you know, when I was using Bumble, for example, it was just creating, you know, almost dopamine spike, dopamine spikes whenever you saw like a profile and it's like, oh wow, like this would be like a really awesome match if this worked out. And it's almost trying to like find the right one. And it's like and it's like, well, like why do I need to feel desperateness to just like find the right person, right? And I think that's what the the app capitalizes on, right? It's just like trying to make you feel like you need to find someone. You need to almost generalize yourself. And I feel like a lot of people lose themselves in the aspect because they want to have more likes or want to have more matches. And so they'll like not mention things that are important to them so that they can appeal to greater mass,
Yeah. And
right? And so that kind of makes them lose themselves a little bit. And so they have I feel like a lot of things can develop from that, like identity issues and that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of things that can be said about dating apps, and that could be another podcast for another day. Um but yeah, I think that even just that can lead to a lot of anxiety, right? And it's like just because um it sucks you in. And so having the willpower to say like, hey, I'm gonna delete it. I'm gonna delete the app. I don't need this in my life. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna use it for some time. And I did notice that when I didn't use it, I felt so much better. And I was like, wow, like it's crazy, how little things like that can help you feel a lot better.
Yeah, it's
And
crazy how we
we
can
live in such a busy world that a lot of noise is just constantly there, and so we don't really have quiet time.
yeah.
And even if it's just, because I've heard of like silent retreats where people just like go on a week silent retreat and nobody talks, nobody says anything, just completely silent. And a lot of people come back changed because, a lot happens when we just turn off the noise, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely, for sure. Yeah, it's like giving the brain a break. It's almost like resetting, right? Because there's so many sources of dopamine in our lives now compared to before, like, because technology is a very kind of big dopamine spiker and it's everywhere now. And maybe that's part of the reason why there's more depression. I don't know. There's something to look into. But I think this whole idea comes around to like, you know, it comes down to dopamine being spiked all the time and trying to find ways through the tool of abstinence to stop spiking the dopamine as much so they have enough dopamine left over to be happy, excited, satisfied, and feel those natural human emotions and enjoy life more and find more satisfaction. Because when we're draining the dopamine all the time, well, no wonder you feel tired and drained and not excited about things anymore and depressed. And yeah, I think that all ties together. I think that's
Yeah.
what those ancient philosophers were getting at, the religions with the Buddhist monks and Christianity. I wonder if that's what they were getting at.
Yeah. Yeah. To live a happier life, you have to almost abstain from dopamine giving aspects. It's almost like that long-term reward, right? We can instantly have it right now, or we can have, twice the amount of pleasure in one instance if we just wait,
Yeah.
a month. It's almost like saying like modern day, like, hey, let's wait for marriage to have sex, right? Like, we just see that in our hookup culture where people are just like, well, I don't care, I'll have that pleasure now instead of like waiting 10, 20 years, or yeah, sometimes, so that when I get married, um then I'll have that experience. And it's almost like we lose that aspect of you know pleasure, of what it means, like, kind of degrading something that could be, so amazing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Like with heavy pornography use, for example, like tying into that, like if you do it a lot, right, it's not as special as it was the first time. And it loses that, it loses the unique specialness that it had before when you first were exposed to it or whatever, right? And like with sex too, and waiting before marriage, the specialness kind of goes away if you indulge in it all the time. And now it's just like a normal thing, like drinking water every day. It's not special anymore. And now it's like almost depressing when you think about it, because it's like this thing that I thought was so great, it's just almost lost its meaning because of overindulgence, I guess is one word we could use. So yeah, because like waiting till marriage almost makes it seem more special, I guess, for depending on who you are, right? Rather than all the time, right? I think that's one way to kind of broaden it, like all the time versus waiting for the right moment, you know, and balance, like we talked about. And this whole abstinence thing, I also want to clarify. Another thing we kind of talked about was maybe it's not something that you need to abstain. I'm not talking about anything we talk about in particular, but just in general for abstinence. Maybe it's not something I need to abstain from for the rest of my life. Maybe it's just something I need to do for a month or a week, and let me see how it affects me. And if I feel better, I need to ride this wave and flow. And yeah, I've reset my brain. I feel better after abstaining for a month, and well, I can start getting back into it now again. And then whenever I start feeling depressed and like not excited, and the negative things start happening again, maybe it's because I'm overindulging again. So let me slow down and find that balance, and let me abstain again, or let me find a better balance and not indulge as much. It's complicated. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's almost hard to say for some people, because some people almost like, let's say for example, influencers, they need social media, they need to be reading graphics and stuff like that, they need to be knowing what the trend is for some of the influencers to know how to be relevant. And so a couple of things like that that I would say are sometimes things that kind of almost make it hard for some people to kind of say like, hey, I'm gonna give up social media when my whole income stream is based on social media.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's kind of hard for, I would say, for some people. But then again, like, one's free to choose what they want. If they want to try that out, maybe they just get another job in the meantime and tell their followers like, hey, I'll be back in a month. I'll let you know how this journey goes. I'll be documenting it and then release all that in a month.
Yeah, and a lot of YouTubers do that. Yeah, they kind of try that abstinence thing and report it on YouTube. Yeah,
And I know a lot of musicians do this too, like where they take just a sabbatical year and don't write any music, and then come back renewed because now they have all these new ideas. And so it's almost like abstinence, like you said, could be periodic, where it's only a certain amount of time, not forever.
yeah,
But that amount of separation can almost like detach you, or kind of help you see the things into perspective, put things into perspective.
yeah. Like I think the final key thing I can think of on that is like to leave people with this, right? The idea of just imagine you're constantly you're constantly triggering dopamine in your brain like every day, over and over and over, right? Imagine what that really does to the brain. Like really think about it for a second. Like what is that really doing to my brain? And and just let that sink in for a second. Like constantly triggering that pleasure chemical in the brain, like almost 24/7,
Yeah.
day after day after day, for years after years after years. Just imagine what that can do to the brain after a while, and then kind of reflect and think like maybe that's why I'm not as excited about life, and then imagine resetting that, resetting it for a certain time and then getting to re-experience that almost like for the first time again. Or almost like what you're alluding to, like sabbatical, like giving a sabbatical for your brain, giving your brain a break from constant stimulation. Because constant stimulation it can be hell, it can be hell, but moderate and balanced stimulation, I think, can be satisfying.
Nice. There we go.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, thank you guys for staying towards the end of this podcast. We really appreciate your time. And also let us know what you thought was interesting. Have you struggled with willpower? What has worked for you? Please let us know down below in the comment section. And also don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because our commitment will continue to provide awesome, amazing content for you guys. Let us know also down below if there's some topics that you would find interesting that we could certainly cover. So let us know down below, and we look forward to the next one. Take care.